In 2015, the IMF quietly dropped a dataset that should have stopped the world cold. No press conference, no breaking news Chiron, just a table of numbers bearing the most consequential economic signal of the century. India had overtaken the US as the world's fastest-growing major economy, 7.5% growth versus America's 2.9%. But here's what made the sharpest minds go silent. The models underneath that number suggested this wasn't a spike. It was a structural trajectory that would reorganize global power within a single generation. Most people scrolled past it. The world was busy with Greece's debt crisis, and that distraction cost the West something it cannot easily recover: time to prepare. Today we're doing something most channels aren't equipped to do. We're going back to 2015, cataloging every major prediction the world's top institutions made about India, and then holding those forecasts against the cold, unforgiving mirror of what actually happened. Because to understand where India is going, you must first understand why almost everyone got where it's already been completely wrong. By mid-2015, Narendra Modi had been Prime Minister for just over a year, swept in with the biggest parliamentary majority India had seen since 1984. The global analyst community split into two camps. Camp 1, Modi represented a structural break from the coalition-era paralysis that had held India's potential hostage for 2 decades. Camp 2, India's deficits, fiscal, infrastructure, regulatory, were simply too deep for any one administration to overcome, regardless of mandate. Both camps had data, both camps had logic, but only one had the right framework. The other was applying Western developmental templates to a civilization that has never, in its entire history, operated by Western developmental templates. That category error is the intellectual crime that mainstream forecasters committed over and over again. Prediction 1. The infrastructure gap will strangle growth. McKinsey estimated in 2015 that India needed to spend 8% of GDP annually on infrastructure just to keep pace. It was spending closer to 5%. Analysts predicted a persistent growth ceiling: clogged ports, inadequate roads, colonial-era railways, legitimate concern, real vulnerability. So what actually happened? Between 2015 and 2024, India built more highway kilometers per year than at any point in its post-independence history, pushing past 10,000 kilometers annually. The country completed a dedicated freight corridor project stuck in planning for a decade. It launched the most ambitious urban metro expansion program in the world, simultaneously building systems across Mumbai, Delhi, Bengaluru, Chennai, Hyderabad, and over a dozen other cities. The infrastructure gap didn't disappear, but the trajectory changed so fundamentally that the pessimist prediction must be marked as directionally wrong. Prediction 2. The goods and services tax will be politically impossible to implement. The GST had been debated and killed repeatedly since the early 2000s. Serious economists called it the equivalent of replacing an airplane's engine mid-flight. The risk of disruption across 29 states, 7 union territories, and millions of informal enterprises was, in their view, too high for any rational government to accept. India implemented GST on July 1, 2017. Not perfectly. Early technical infrastructure collapsed under load, and small businesses felt real disruption. But 4 years after rollout, monthly GST collections were regularly crossing 1 trillion rupees. 7 years in, it had fundamentally restructured India's tax architecture, expanded the formal economy, and handed the government a real-time data window into commercial activity no previous administration had ever possessed. The prediction wasn't just wrong. It was wrong in a way that revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what Indian political economy is capable of when the executive has sufficient mandate. Prediction 3. India's digital ambitions will stall on connectivity deficits. In 2015, India had 267 million internet users, about 20% of its population, concentrated in cities. Cautious optimists believed broad digital inclusion was possible by the mid-2030s. Pessimists said India's linguistic diversity alone would prevent genuine mass adoption. Then came September 2016, and nobody had modeled what was about to happen. Reliance Jio launched and permanently destroyed every prior assumption about Indian digital adoption. Within 6 months, Jio had 100 million subscribers, the fastest telecom ramp in human history. Data costs collapsed from among the highest in Asia to the lowest in the world. By 2023, the average Indian mobile user was consuming over 15 gigabytes of data per month. That's a hundredfold increase in under a decade. The second-order effects are where it gets truly historic. Built on the government's India Stack architecture, the Unified Payments Interface became the vehicle through which digital access converted into economic formalization at unprecedented speed. By 2023, India was processing more real-time digital payment transactions than the US, UK, France, Germany, and Australia combined. The 2015 prediction was wrong, not slightly, by an order of magnitude in the opposite direction. Prediction 4. Make in India will be undercut by China's supply chain dominance. The skeptics weren't wrong about China. 3 decades of vertical integration, deep supply chains, mature infrastructure. The argument was simple. You don't displace a 30-year ecosystem with a government branding campaign. And from 2015 to 2020, the skeptics were largely right. More headlines than factories. India's share of global manufacturing value stayed stubbornly below 3%. Then 3 things happened at once. The US-China trade war forced multinationals to ask a question they hadn't seriously asked in decades. What's the geopolitical risk of single-country supply chain concentration? COVID-19 then delivered the most brutal possible answer, as global supply chains seized and governments couldn't source basic medical equipment. And then China's relationship with the Western world deteriorated further. Ukraine, Taiwan, the fundamental incompatibility of its authoritarian model with the trade architecture democracies were willing to sustain. India didn't create this opportunity, but India was the only country on earth with the combination of scale, democratic governance, English language infrastructure, technical workforce, and geographic positioning to absorb what global corporations were now urgently executing. Apple's decision to manufacture iPhones in India through Foxconn and Tata was the signal moment. Not because Apple alone moves the macro needle, but because Apple's supply chain decisions are the most carefully calibrated in global technology. When Apple moves, every multinational notices. The analysts who predicted failure were modeling India against China's existing supply chain. They were not modeling India against a world in which China's supply chain became a geopolitical liability. That scenario wasn't in their base case. It wasn't even in their stress case. We have to be intellectually honest here. One 2015 prediction was essentially correct, that India's social development indicators would remain a persistent lag on its economic story. Malnutrition rates, while declining, remain structurally elevated. Public school learning outcomes continued to disappoint despite high enrollment. Healthcare infrastructure outside major cities remains insufficient. The gender gap in economic participation remains one of India's most significant structural constraints. These aren't superficial problems. They reflect decades of underinvestment that no single administration's ambition can resolve. But here's the context. Even this accurate prediction misses. India's 7% growth trajectory generates a compounding expansion of fiscal capacity that makes addressing these deficits progressively more affordable. The question is no longer whether India can fix its human development deficiencies. At this growth rate, it demonstrably can. The question is whether it will prioritize doing so with the urgency the human stakes demand. In 2015, the dominant Western consensus viewed India as a swing state, a country that would eventually formalize alignment with the US-led security architecture in Asia as the US-China rivalry intensified. India has done no such thing. It deepened the Quad partnership. It signed foundational defense agreements with Washington. It increased defense procurement from American manufacturers. And simultaneously, it refused to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine, bought Russian oil at discounted prices during Western sanctions, continued full BRICS participation, and consistently declined any framework that would subordinate its foreign policy to any external power. The West initially called this confused. By 2024, the more honest analysts had revised that entirely. What India was executing wasn't confusion. It was the most sophisticated multi-alignment strategy since the original non-aligned movement, calibrated for a world where the stakes are vastly higher and India's leverage is vastly greater. India now understands something most smaller nations can't afford to act on. In a world of great power competition, a country with sufficient scale doesn't have to choose sides. It makes itself indispensable to multiple sides simultaneously. It extracts maximum strategic benefit while surrendering autonomy to none. So what's the final scorecard? The experts of 2015 were wrong about the speed of reform, wrong about digital adoption, wrong about manufacturing, wrong about India's strategic autonomy, partially right about social development deficits, and deeply, fundamentally wrong about the framework. The idea that India could be understood using the same developmental templates applied to earlier emerging market transitions. India is not China circa 1990, not South Korea circa 1970. It is a civilizational economy of 1.4 billion people, democratic, nuclear, technically sophisticated, with a diaspora network spanning every major economy on Earth, and a growth trajectory the IMF, World Bank, and Goldman Sachs now recognize as structurally the most important single variable in the global economy for the next 3 decades. The IMF projects India to become the world's third largest economy in nominal dollar terms before the end of this decade. Goldman Sachs projects it to overtake the United States in PPP terms well before mid-century. These are not optimistic fringe predictions. They are the central case forecasts of the most conservative institutions on Earth. The lesson of 2015 is not that the experts were stupid. They weren't. The lesson is that even intelligent, credentialed, data-equipped analysts can be catastrophically wrong when they apply the wrong framework to a country that refuses to conform to frameworks it did not design. India has always refused. That refusal, that civilizational insistence on its own developmental logic, is itself the most important data point of all. In our next video, we move from the retrospective to the perspective, examining the financial architecture India is building toward 2047, its centenary of independence, the rupee internationalization strategy, the defense industrial pivot from import dependence to export ambition, and the AI and quantum investments positioning India as not merely a participant in the next technological revolution, but one of its primary architects. If 2015 taught us that experts missed India's last decade, the analysis ahead will make sure you are not caught without a framework for its next one. The strategic map of the future is being drawn. The question is whether you're in the room.